When I moved into my new apartment, I was thrilled. It was a cozy little place with a nice view, and I thought I had found a perfect home. The walls were freshly painted and the floors gleamed with a recent polish. The building itself had a quaint charm, reminiscent of older, more peaceful times. Little did I know, my new neighbor would turn my life into a nightmare. At first, he seemed harmless, an old man, perhaps in his late 60s, living alone in the apartment next door. He had a friendly smile and always greeted me with a nod. I didn't think much of it until I started noticing odd behaviors. It began with small things like seeing him pacing in the hallway at odd hours, muttering to himself in a language I couldn't understand. One evening, as I was coming home from work, I saw him standing in the hallway just staring at my door. His eyes were vacant, almost as if he was in a trance. I greeted him, trying to break the tension, but he didn't respond. He just turned and walked back into his apartment, closing the door slowly behind him. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just having a bad day. But things only got worse. Late at night, I began hearing strange noises coming from his apartment. It sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor, followed by soft, eerie humming. The sound was unsettling, like a lullaby from a forgotten time, and it went on for hours, making it impossible for me to sleep. Some nights, the humming would stop abruptly, only to be replaced by what sounded like whispered conversations, though I could never make out the words. One night, I gathered the courage to knock on his door and ask him to keep it down. He opened the door just a crack, and the smell that wafted out was unbearable, like rotting meat and something metallic, a stench so thick it seemed to cling to my clothes. His face appeared in the narrow opening, eyes wide and bloodshot. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you," he said in a hoarse whisper. "I'll keep it down." But he didn't. The noises continued and they were getting more unsettling. There were nights I could hear what sounded like muffled cries, and other times it was a strange, rhythmic tapping. I reported it to the building manager, but they dismissed it, saying he was just an old man living alone. The manager assured me that they would look into it, but their assurances felt hollow, and the strange occurrences persisted. One weekend, I decided to visit my family and get away from the constant noise. When I returned, I found a note slipped under my door. It was from my neighbor. "I know you've been watching me," it read. "You should mind your own business, or else." Fear gripped me. What did he mean? Was he spying on me? I installed a security camera in the hallway to keep an eye on things. The footage revealed something horrifying. Every night around 3 a.m., my neighbor would come out of his apartment and stand in front of my door, staring at it for hours, sometimes whispering inaudible words. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural, and his eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim hallway light. It was as if he was in a trance, a puppet to some unseen force, and I began to dread the small hours of the morning. The final straw came one night, when I woke up to find my front door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. I checked the security footage, and what I saw made my blood run cold. My neighbor had entered my apartment while I was asleep. He walked around, touching my furniture, and stood by my bed, watching me for what felt like an eternity. Then, he left, leaving the door open behind him. I called the police, and they arrested him. It turned out he had a history of mental illness and had been off his medication for months. They found disturbing items in his apartment, photos of me taken through my window, personal belongings that had gone missing, and a journal detailing his obsession with me. The journal was filled with ramblings about our supposed connection, with pages and pages of incoherent thoughts and disturbing sketches of my face. I moved out the next day, unable to stay another minute in that apartment. The whole experience left me traumatized, and I still have nightmares about it. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that I hear that eerie humming, and I can't help but check if my door is locked. The trauma of those nights lingers with me, a shadow that refuses to be dispelled by the light of day. As time went on, I tried to piece together more about my neighbor's life. I spoke with other residents in the building, and they told me strange stories about him. Some mentioned seeing him speaking to himself in the basement, holding what looked like old tattered books. Others recalled hearing footsteps on the roof at night, even though access to it was restricted. One particularly unnerving tale came from a neighbor who had lived in the building for over a decade. She claimed that the old man had once been a well-respected professor at a nearby university, but had suddenly disappeared from public life after a tragic accident involving his family. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began researching his past. The university records confirmed that he had indeed been a professor of ancient languages and occult studies. His research focused on esoteric rituals and forgotten deities, topics that, at the time, seemed more like the stuff of legends than anything real. But after his family died in a mysterious house fire, he became reclusive, eventually moving into the apartment next to mine. What unnerved me the most were the rumors surrounding his family's death. Some said it was an accident, a tragic case of faulty wiring, but others whispered about darker possibilities, about rituals gone wrong and vengeful spirits. The more I dug, the more I found references to strange symbols and ancient texts that matched the sketches in his journal. It seemed like his obsession with these occult practices had consumed him, driving him to the brink of madness. Even after moving to a new place, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows sent chills down my spine. I installed more security measures, better locks, motion sensor lights, and even a dog to keep me company. But none of it could erase the memory of those nights or the haunting sense of unease. In my new apartment, I tried to start fresh. I painted the walls bright colors, filled the rooms with plants, and invited friends over regularly to create a sense of warmth and safety. Yet the nightmares persisted. In my dreams, I would find myself back in that old apartment, the eerie humming echoing in the background, my neighbor's vacant eyes staring at me from the shadows. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and it would take hours to calm down enough to fall back asleep. I decided to seek therapy to deal with the trauma. My therapist helped me understand that what I experienced was real, and that my fear was a natural response to the invasion of my privacy and the threat to my safety. We worked through my anxieties, step by step, and slowly, I began to regain some sense of normalcy. But even with professional help, the scars remained. As part of my healing process, I started writing about my experiences. I chronicled every detail, from the moment I moved into that cursed apartment to the day I left it behind. Writing became a form of catharsis, a way to exorcise the demons that had taken root in my mind. I shared my story online, hoping that it might help others who had gone through similar experiences. The response was overwhelming. People reached out with words of support, sharing their own stories of haunted pasts and encounters with unsettling neighbors. In time, I found a new sense of purpose. I became an advocate for mental health awareness, particularly focusing on the importance of community and support systems. I realized that my neighbor's descent into madness was not just a personal tragedy, but also a failure of the system that should have been there to help him. His story, intertwined with mine, became a catalyst for change. I still carry the weight of those dark days, but I've learned to find strength in my vulnerability. The fear that once paralyzed me has become a driving force for compassion and understanding. I'll never forget the horror of that apartment, but I've come to see it as a part of my journey, a chapter in the story of who I am. As I continue to move forward, I remain vigilant, always mindful of the shadows that lurk just beyond the light. But I no longer live in fear. I've reclaimed my life, my sense of safety, and my peace of mind. And while the past will always be a part of me, it no longer defines me. I am more than the nightmares that once haunted my nights. I am a survivor, a storyteller, and a beacon of hope for others navigating their own darkness. In an old residential building, Sarah had finally found her dream apartment. After years of renting and moving from place to place, she was thrilled to have a space to call her own. The building had a nostalgic charm with its high ceilings, wide staircases, and creaky wooden railings. The neighbors were friendly enough, but everyone kept to themselves, respecting each other's privacy. Sarah settled into her new life with ease. She enjoyed the quiet of her home and the routine of her daily life. But a few months after moving in, something started to disturb her peace. One evening, as she returned from work, she noticed a faint but unpleasant smell in the hallway. At first, she thought it might be something temporary. Perhaps someone had forgotten to take out the trash. However, the smell persisted and grew stronger each day. The neighbors began to whisper among themselves, each suspecting the other of being the source of the odor. Sarah tried to locate the origin of the smell, but it seemed to permeate the entire floor. One day, while coming home, she met an elderly woman on the staircase. The woman looked exhausted and frail. Sarah recognized her as the neighbor who lived in the apartment next to hers. "Hello," Sarah said softly, trying not to startle her. "I'm Sarah, your neighbor. We haven't met before." The old woman looked at her with tired eyes. "Good evening," she replied in a weak voice. "I'm Martha Jones. Nice to meet you." Sarah wanted to ask about the smell, but she hesitated. Martha Jones seemed so fragile that any additional stress might break her. The woman shuffled back into her apartment, leaving Sarah with her thoughts. The smell didn't go away. In fact, it became unbearable, especially at night. Sarah found it difficult to sleep, her mind racing with possible explanations. One night, when the stench was particularly strong, she decided to call the building management to report the issue. The next day, maintenance workers arrived to inspect the building. They checked the basement, the garbage chute, and the plumbing, but found nothing unusual. The smell was clearly not coming from any of these sources. Feeling helpless, Sarah decided to talk to her neighbors, hoping someone might have more information. The neighbors were equally puzzled. Everyone complained about the smell, but no one knew where it was coming from. Sarah decided to try talking to Martha Jones again. She knocked on the woman's door but received no answer. After a few minutes, the door finally creaked open, and Martha Jones appeared, looking even more worn out than before. "I'm sorry to bother you," Sarah began, "but we're all worried about this smell. Do you happen to know where it's coming from?" Martha Jones turned pale and looked like she might faint. She quickly shut the door without saying a word. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something was definitely wrong. As days passed, the smell intensified. Sarah could no longer stand living in such conditions and decided to call the police. She explained the situation, and a patrol car arrived shortly after. The officers began knocking on doors, trying to find the source of the odor. When they reached Martha Jones's apartment, there was no response for a long time. The police were persistent, and eventually, the old woman let them in. Moments later, they emerged with horrified expressions on their faces. "You should all evacuate the building," one of the officers said. "We've found the source of the smell." Sarah's legs felt weak as she made her way outside. She watched in horror as the police carried out the decomposed body of Martha Jones's husband. He had been dead for months. Martha Jones, not knowing what to do, had continued to live with his corpse. The aftermath of this discovery left Sarah shaken. She couldn't sleep, haunted by the images in her mind. The neighbors were in shock, unable to comprehend the horror that had been hidden behind the walls of their building. Martha Jones was taken to a psychiatric hospital. Sarah struggled to move on, but the events had left an indelible mark on her. She could no longer look at her neighbors without wondering what secrets they might be hiding. The experience changed her forever, making her more cautious and aware of the silent suffering that might be occurring behind closed doors.